hopefully I want to take you on a journey today that shows us a little bit about what's going on in Israel, in particular in this time of crisis, and how Aliyah really connects to this whole story. As you probably are aware, Israel has fared better than most in terms of this current crisis. This is up-to-date information about Israel. The unfortunate reality is we've lost 262 people. We've had 16,000 and change cases. But if you look at how this is breaking out relative to other countries in the world, especially, our unique club of the OECD, which are the leading economies, Israel's doing really quite well. And in fact, when you look at the overall curve, we haven't flattened the curve. We've come down on the other side. And today's headlines in the Times of Israel is right in front of you. And basically, we've had 13 new virus cases in the last 24 hours, which is unbelievable, way down. And when you realize that the majority of the cases, the vast majority in Israel, have been striking two communities, the Haredi community, which according to Minister Derry, our Minister of the Interior, is 70% of the total infections so far, and the Arab community, which is reported to be north of 10 and maybe as much as 20%, you realize what this 13 new cases means, which is that, thank God, we're in a different realm. Now, Israel has released most of the restrictions. Most of our kids are back to school. They'll all be back by the end of this week. We're back to work, and that's happening, quite quickly, although we still have way too many on furlough and on unemployment. Stores are opening up, everything but the cafes and the sporting facilities and health clubs and whatnot, which are still, weddings are still limited to 50 people. But Israel is quickly getting used to a new norm. And we really look outside of Israel and in particular, the Jewish communities outside of Israel have been hit terribly. And it's not just New York or London or Paris. It's Morocco and other places of Jewish life which have been decimated. And you have to ask yourself, why is it that the death rate in these places has been among the Jews higher than, in many cases, the non-Jews? So, for example, in a place like London, there have been, or in England in general, there have been almost 400 Jewish deaths, which means that for the population of 250,000 Jews, they've had about 1.5 times the total deaths of Israel. And that is just extraordinary. And I think it goes a long way to tell you that Israel managed this crisis relatively well at the governmental level, at the society level, at the healthcare level. And that really brings me to my topic of, what is going on today with Aliyah, and how are we really supposed to approach it? And I think that trying in a time of crisis to talk about Aliyah is the right time. Because typically, if you look at the traditional big waves of Aliyah, they have required a crisis to get moving. It hasn't, even since the beginning of the state, a quiet sort of organic the big moves of Aliyah have been because of some kind of a push or crisis. And in fact, if you look at the news recently, we're talking about the fact that there's going to be a wave of, right now the numbers they're talking about are 200,000 Jews who in the next 18 to 24 months are being expected to show up here. Now, this is going to be largely new immigrants, but even more largely Israelis coming home. And this is probably a lot to do with the crisis and the fact that Israel has emerged as a relative oasis. Hard to call a country which has lost 264 people an oasis, but relative to the rest of the world, with the small exception of a couple of places like New Zealand, Taiwan, and Australia, we've been doing really, really well. And I think what people are looking at when they think about coming home today is not just that we are, getting through this better than most on a statistical number, but that our life expectancy in general is so high. You know that in Israel, our life expectancy is about 4 years more on average than the United States. That doesn't mean, by the way, that you get a 4-year extension if you come here. That would be nice if we could prove that. But it's a remarkable statistic. Our healthcare system is unbelievable. And the fact is, when you look at our mortality rate, where we had 1.5% mortality, when that stacks up to other, smart and wealthy and expensive countries such as Germany, where the mortality is many, many times that kind of material. So we're very, very lucky with our healthcare system. But I think people also look at our resilience, the fact that Israel is really strong in times of crisis. This isn't our first rodeo. We've had wars and terror attacks, and when it really becomes a crisis, Israel exceeds. And the leadership knows what to do, and more importantly, the people know what to do. I also think people appreciate our sense of solidarity, that while we have been, over the last several years, certainly more politicized and more polarized than ever before, and we're usually at a pretty high level of polarization here. On the other hand, everyone pulled together. And we even got a government, which is going to be sworn in tomorrow. And that's amazing. It took a crisis perhaps to get us this government. And on top of that, and this is one of the things which I think people really ignore too much in the Aliyah business, if you will, is the economic strength of Israel. Israel is going to come out of this with a very robust recovery. Right now, we've got a lot of unemployment, but let's remember that just before there was almost zero unemployment. The economy has been growing at rapid rates. And most importantly, we've built up a huge surplus of foreign reserves. And in fact, our stimulus has really just been a small amount relative to others at this point, about $25 billion of stimulus. But when you look at that compared to our GDP, it's a fraction of what stimulus has been in other countries. And I think that we are going to see a strong return. What's interesting about Israel's economy is it's driven by high tech, the business that I'm in at OurCrowd, which has been basically why we're called Startup Nation. And in particular, I'm very, very proud of what Israel is doing during this pandemic in terms of leading the fight against the virus and about helping our societies transition into the new normal. So if you look at pandemics, there have been pandemics, for 100 years, and this is not the last one, I'm afraid. We're going to have more. But Israel, as one of the world's most innovative countries, and don't believe me, or we don't even need to put up slides from the JNF or from the World Zionist Organization. The World Economic Forum did it for us, and believe me, they're not Zionists. These are the Davos people, and they rank Israel number 1 or number 2 in terms of venture capital and innovation, and it keeps on getting better each and every year. And when you look at what's going to happen in Israel and what is happening now, is that there's just a lot of innovation going on around prevention and containment, whether it's vaccines, we'll talk about that in a second, about treatment and healing and therapeutics and diagnostics, and about what we call mitigation and continuity, which is food security and business continuity and cybersecurity and whatnot. And this is areas where Israel really leads. Now, what's happening is that trends that were apparent in Israel and in the world before the crisis are now accelerating. And the new normal represents a bunch of things that started before, whether it's e-commerce or home delivery or robotic process automation or distance learning or telehealth. These were companies and trends that started years ago, but they've now taken on such a salience. They've gone into warp speed. The CEO of Microsoft just said in their quarterly call that there has been 2 years of digital improvement in the last 2 months. We've all become Zoom experts, or we think we are. We all are living a digital world, which, by the way, presents a real opportunity for investors and a huge opportunity for Israel going forward. Now there are going to be winners, people who are in this new and in these healthcare fighting areas, and they're going to be losers. Not a good time to be in the oil industry or in commercial real estate. And there'll be other industries that'll be rejiggering and rebalancing themselves. But what's going to drive everything is going to be AI. And Israel is a world leader in artificial intelligence. Israel is, would you believe, tied for second with China. The US leads in terms of number of startups, but Israel and China have almost the same number. And think about that. With China's population, which is just a little bit bigger than ours, we have the same number of artificial intelligence startups. It's remarkable. Now, in Israel at the moment, there are just so many technologies being developed for testing, for new therapeutics, for ventilators, and even for vaccines. And we were very excited just a week ago, our new investment in Migvax, which is the leading vaccine company coming from Israel. And would you believe that this is a company that started out 4 years ago working with coronavirus because they were tasked by the Israeli government up in the Galil. They're headquartered, would you believe, in Kiryat Shmona. And I know what JNF does for Kiryat Shmona, and kol hakavod to you guys. And what Nefesh B'Nefesh does in terms of helping immigrants get up to the north. We're big believers in the building of the north. But listen to this. The world's redemption might come from the Galil. From this little institute called Migal, they were working on chicken viruses. And it makes a lot of sense, of course, because all of our grandmothers always said that chicken soup is Jewish penicillin. Wouldn't it be great that a program that started with chickens ends up bringing the vaccine that we all want to see quickly to really get our lives back to normal? And this vaccine is going to be an oral vaccine. It doesn't use live or dead virus at all. It's a subunit. And it's going to be a very interesting vaccine platform for mutations. So we're very hopeful for that. There are other companies that are at work on this, such as Site Diagnostics, who've managed with their digital AI-driven blood tester to take 2 drops of blood from a pinprick, no more hunting for veins, and give you a complete blood count. That every COVID patient needs a CBC to track what they're doing, but they don't want to commingle the blood into these centralized blood laboratories. So all of a sudden, this company is catching fire and working with people like Sheba and hospitals around the world. Companies like Pulm1 are doing pulmonary testing and lung function testing for the patients who've recovered, because we know that the people who've come out of COVID are going to have some impairment and need to get that testing. Rather than go into the hospital, they can get it done at their local doctor. Rather than go into a huge body box, it can be done on a desktop. There are companies like TytoCare who are using clinical grade telehealth so you can literally get diagnosis capability in the hands of moms and dads who can stick devices safely into your kid's ears, nose, and throat, get sounds from the chest, and this is then transmitted live to a doctor or even an AI. And this company is also becoming huge, just announced a $50 million round of funding as a result of the crisis because of the emphasis on telehealth. And then there are more esoteric things, but not less important, such as robotic process automation, which uses bots to write software. So this company, Cryon, was asked by both Klali, the largest healthcare organization in Israel, and Maccabi to hook up the COVID data into their core database systems. Now, this was going to take their program over 2 months to get it done normally. And the bots, they brought in the bots and they got it done 48 hours over a Shabbat in the weekend using unbelievable technology to provide that kind of connectivity. We know that data is driving everything. MeMed is a company which is giving you an instantaneous detection of either a viral or bacterial infection by studying the immune system's response. And through this AI-driven technology, they are hoping to get much earlier detection of asymptomatic COVID patients, perhaps cutting a couple of days off of that curve. And it's rather pretty exciting. VocalZoom is doing new sensors for airports that are contactless, that aren't requiring somebody to go up and hold a temperature gauge to your forehead, and giving you other critical data as well from a distance. Switch is allowing you to manage the COVID virus from your cell phone. It's used already for diabetes and oncology, and now moving into COVID. Barcode is creating personalized chemo treatments, but now using the same nanocapsulation technology will potentially speed up PCR testing, which is one of the big bottlenecks, by 100 times, and make it literally 1% of the time to get the same results. Texty is allowing engineers and technicians to come to your house and to give you help. So, for example, Verizon in New York, you don't want a Verizon technician in your house, but you certainly need your Fios or your TV or your internet to work. They'll do it with this software developed by this Israeli company. And CyberMDX is keeping our hospitals and our medical devices all safe, because the hackers are out. And what they really like to do is to hack into your ventilator or your pacemaker, send you a ransom note, or send your doctor or family a ransom note saying you got 30 minutes to live unless you respond. And finally, Sense Education is doing distance education in a whole new way, providing real solutions for the 1.5 billion students who are not in school at the moment. So that's just a little snapshot from my world at OurCrowd of the kind of companies that are changing our world and fighting the virus and enabling a new normal to emerge, which is a better life for all of us, hopefully. And when you think about that and you realize, wait, this is just your portfolio or a piece of your portfolio, you think of all the venture funds and all the startups, the 7,000, you begin to realize that Israel is a dynamic and unbelievably vibrant technology scene. We are going to weather this storm. We're going to bring new investment into the country. Believe it or not, at OurCrowd, our numbers are up year to year, and there's a lot of investor interest now in Israel and coming into these companies and others who are essentially providing hope. And this is the same hope which is going to bring Olim. Because it's not just the push of the crisis that's going to cause this wave of Aliyah, but it's going to be the message of Tzionut, of Jewish fulfillment, but more importantly, of being an Or LaGoyim, that today Israel is fulfilling its promise. We're not just another country like all the others. We're an extraordinary country doing great things with a great society and a great people, a lot of fun. And we look forward to seeing you here. As immigrants, you guys are invited to contact me at my email, which is Jon, Jon, at OurCrowd.com. And I'd love to answer some questions if you have some time for that. Is there anyone here who's handling questions?
We have a question from Stefan. Can you speak more about how you're investing in the Galilee region and why you're optimistic about economic development in the north?
That's a great question, Stefan. Thank you. First of all, as I mentioned before, we're backing this huge vaccine project, and we're raising $12 million initially, but we'll ultimately, I think, be putting in tens of millions of dollars just into this one company as we scale up and hopefully save the world, okay, with this vaccine, which we're very excited about. In addition to that, we're partnered with some of Israel's largest companies, Tnuva, which is Israel's largest dairy, one of the largest dairies in the world, by the way, which is today owned by a huge Chinese company and local investors, as well as Tempo, which is Israel's largest drink company. And we've built a food incubator in the north, also in Kiryat Shmona, which is backing other kinds of food technology. I'm a believer that once the infrastructure is built properly and we have the fast roads and the fast trains and the ability in our small country to move from place to place, who wouldn't want to live in the north? If you've been in the north this season, it's unbelievable. It's so gorgeous. There's so much water. The Kinneret, the Sea of Galilee, is literally less than 10 centimeters away from becoming overflow. And the north is going to be a great place for investment, for living, and we're going to be a big part of it at OurCrowd and looking for more investments and more opportunities up there. I'm getting another question here from Alexandra about the ROI value prop of making Aliyah in the coming year. In terms of what is the payback? Well, look, I think that we need to be giving people literally a economic calculator, because Jewish families, especially those who are more traditionally minded and want their kids to have a Jewish education in day school, have such an obvious economic interest in going to live in Israel. I mean, when you sit there and you calculate, okay, what if 4 kids cost you annually in day school? Let's just use 25,000 as a rough number. I know many schools are more and some are, God willing, less, but that's already $100,000 a year just for your kids' day school education. Multiply that for 12 years, and then you add your health care, which you pay in the States, and that could be $30,000 or $40,000 for that family of 6 with 4 kids. And then you talk about your synagogue dues and your JCC dues, and none of this stuff you pay in Israel. And then it gets much worse when you talk about college, because at a $50,000 or $60,000 or $70,000 a year tuition times 4, forget the graduate degrees, times 4 kids, you got another $1 million. Amortize that over that period of time. You're literally looking at about $250,000 or $300,000 of after-tax money that you have to start with as a whole to live in America. Who does that? That means you have to make $500,000 more just to break even. And I think that we need to do much better job of showing this in dollars and cents. Jews are smart, okay? As soon as you start showing this ROI, you begin to get it. And look, I think, I don't mean to belittle the challenge of moving to a new country, any country, especially Israel. It's not easy. Language and culture and just everything. But on the other hand, there are absolute benefits, both on an economic level, on a healthy living level, on a social level, on a fun level. It's the best place to be in the middle of the world. And now there are just wonderful, wonderful opportunities here. Now, we're getting a question of beyond the traditional family, what about, secular families? Why make Aliyah now? Again, for the same reasons. If you've been in Tel Aviv lately, that's one of the most fun, open, tolerant, dynamic cities in the world in terms of its culture, the business scene, and it's wild. And what's funny is that I meet people all the time, Jewish and non-Jewish. You'd be shocked at how many of the non-Jews are excited about Israel and what Israel means. And these are not just Christian evangelicals. These are regular secular non-Jews who say, yeah, I love coming to Israel. It's the beaches, it's that food, it's that party scene, it's the fact that people are so open. And I really think that we haven't done yet enough of a job to basically talk about how this all plays out and how it works. I think the virus and what's gone on over the last several months done the Aliyah movement a great favor. because people aren't stupid. They have their eyes open. And when they see the response of different countries and different locales and how Israel has handled this and what's going on in Israel and the sense of hope and dynamism that Israel is not just giving to its own people and to the Jewish people, but to the whole world, I think this is going to result in more Aliyah. I know it in my kishkas. It's going to happen. Now we're getting another question about the Negev. What's going on down there? Well, we're active in the Negev too. We just announced plans to build our second incubator in the Negev. In OurCrowd, we invest in three kinds of activities. We have 200 actually portfolio companies that, to correct the numbers said in the beginning, it's 1.4 billion under management. So you can either invest in an individual company like a Migvax or like a Site Diagnostics. You can also invest in funds, and we can provide investments into our incubators. And we operate in Israel 4 incubators, 1 in Jerusalem, 1 in Kiryat Shmona, and 2 in the south. So one of our incubators is in Beersheba, where we're focusing on cybersecurity, which is the flavor du jour down there, as well as a particular emphasis on medical cybersecurity. And we're investing in early stage companies there. And we also just announced a new incubator in Yerucham, which is focused on medical cannabis. The mayor of Yerucham is trying to turn Yerucham into the medical cannabis capital of the world. And we're going to do a lot of work to help her do that. And we're being asked the question of, in Israel, what are the average returns to investors and limited partners in good tech funds which invest in the high-tech sector? It really depends. It's a range. I know that our funds are averaging roughly between 15 and 20% IRR net of fees and net of carried interest. It depends on the fund, depends on the vintage. This is a particularly good time to be making investments because traditionally down markets or periods of time when there's a downturn in the Dow or in the NASDAQ, by the way, is up this year, don't forget. It's a good time to make investments because you're buying assets cheaper. And you're not buying for a 1 month or a 2 month time frame, you're buying for years in the venture capital business. But in addition to this downturn factor, which is a good buy signal, there's also the fact that we're in a civilizational or social inflection point where this new normal is emerging and these companies who are pioneering the new normal are being accelerated, the way that Microsoft's CEO talked about. We're seeing another question. What happens when Israel develops a vaccine for COVID-19? It's interesting. Will other companies be advised to make investments so as to, help the economy of Israel? We are already getting countries who are approaching us who don't have viable vaccine programs on their own saying, can we invest and can we get access? It's not clear yet whether we're going to do that, but there is a huge foot race on among all the countries in the world. So it's not just about getting the vaccine quickly, but it's about getting production. We're going to need billions and billions of doses. And no matter how much we're scaling up for it, we can only choose, the leading candidates. And there's going to be a scarcity, which is going to take a long time to resolve itself. And God willing, we should, get one of these. I think that's pretty much all the questions. I hope I've answered them all. Oh no, I've got another 2 questions, which I didn't. We were asked about, with so many people moving back, how is Israel going to handle the high costs of real estate? And what efforts is Israel doing to make living in Israel affordable? What a great question that is. Look, Israeli real estate is wild. It's like Manhattan. Or worse yet, Silicon Valley. It's very, very expensive here. But the reason that it's so expensive is because the government controls 90% of the land. And the government has the ability, if it so desires at some point in their infinite wisdom, to reduce land prices and to make it more available. I hope that will happen. I hope it doesn't bring down real estate prices, because in Israel, 70% of the population owns its own house. Very, very high percentage, even more so than the US. So we don't want people to get poorer, but we need to have programs that will enable young couples in particular and immigrants to really afford housing. The problem is that everyone wants to live in Tel Aviv, or in Baca, Jerusalem. And that's not achievable unless you have real bucks today. So it's a problem. The government's working on it. And I think we need to do a lot more work. And I think, that's pretty much, I think it answers all of the questions. We're asking, there's one more. Are we involved with ag tech and not just food and animal production? And the answer is yes, we are. We have a robust agricultural platform, includes companies like CropX, who are essentially building a in-ground sensor that gives you wireless drip irrigation, if you will, as well as fertilizer input. We have a company called Tyrannus, which is doing aerial surveillance of agriculture. A great company called Consumer Physics, which is giving you a pocket spectrometer to measure sugar in berries or when corn is ready for harvest. Israeli ag tech is huge, and there's a real renaissance going on. And now with all the focus on food security and the supply chain for food, making sure we're all fed during this crisis, I think Israel is going to do well. So again, I want to thank our friends at Nefesh B'Nefesh. We love you dearly. And the JNF. Keep up this amazing work. You guys are all doing wonderful things. I felt privileged to be able to spend some of my time with you. If you would like to write me, you can write me to Jon at OurCrowd, or I have another slide, which actually I was using at at another webinar. I'm going to show you if I can make it work. You don't have to put UK webinar. What I would say is put JNF webinar. I'll go get a mailbox created. Just wait an hour. And if you send an email to jnfwebinar@ourcrowd.com, we will send you a copy of the slides I used. And if you would like, send you more information, or you could ask questions at that channel or to Jon at OurCrowd. So jnfwebinar@ourcrowd.com. I'll get operational within the next hour. And again, thank you very much for your time and your attention.